Hi, and welcome to the recorded version of this presentation. Today we're going to be talking about stress of COVID-19 as it relates to the disability sector. So before we begin the presentation proper, just a few words about SACS. SACS is an organisational psychology business, and we're involved in provision of a range of organisational psychology services. Psychological testing is our biggest business. As well as that, we undertake wellbeing surveys and 360-degree feedback. And we're also involved in organisational and individual development, change management, coaching, career transition management. We help organisations to recruit, and we operate according to the scientist practitioner model, mainly in partnership with Deakin University, with whom we've had multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals over the last 4 or 5 years in particular, but with some other universities from time to time. But basically we take an evidence-based approach to people management. So just to tell you what we're hoping to achieve in this presentation, we're going to be talking about stressors, COVID-19 and others. I mean, COVID-19 is a stressor. It's something that causes people to experience stress. And so we will be talking about stress. Then we'll be talking about what stress does to us, and we'll be talking about acute versus chronic stress. So acute stress is something that occurs at a particular time, but it can become chronic if it goes on long enough. In all of these topics, we'll be relating this back to the disability sector, and I'm going to show you some profiles of the personality and cognitive ability characteristics of people within the disability sector. And so you can relate to the question of generally how stressable will the workforce in the disability sector be in comparison with other workforces. We're going to be talking about stress and how it becomes trauma. We'll be talking about warning signs, and warning signs both in yourself and in other people. And we'll be talking about self-management, and then we'll be talking about leadership in the world of COVID-19. So where we are in Australia at the moment, as I write this, is that we've come out of lockdowns in most places, but business is still constrained to a great degree. Certainly interaction with other countries is very limited, and we have a stressful event of itself, which is where people have been working remotely for many months in offices away from offices around Australia, and now they're seeking to return to offices, which of course is a stressor of itself. So we'll talk about some of that as we go through. So let's talk about stressors and stress. Stress being the biological effect, stressors being the things that cause it. And so here is a very old study. This is Holmes Rahe from 1967. And the reason that we quote such an old study is that recent studies don't seem to have changed the balance of life stressors very markedly at all. In other words, the stressors that applied in 1967 appear pretty much to be the stressors that apply today. And so Holmes and Rahe adopted the methodology of giving points based on thousands of surveys, points based on what were the most stressful events. And the death of a spouse for most people is the most stressful event. Divorce is very stressful, marital separation is very stressful, imprisonment is very stressful, death of a close family member. And then we've marked some of these stressors with asterisks because they relate to the whole COVID-19 event. So personal injury or illness, and of course, sadly, some people have had death of family members due to COVID-19, marriage dismissal from work. So even though in many places the pressure of COVID-19 is starting to retreat somewhat, the economic effects are still being felt. And for many people, this has led to the loss of their jobs, or at least danger of the loss of their jobs. Change in health of family members, business readjustment. We've all been through business readjustments of various sorts associated with COVID-19. Change in financial state, certainly that applies to many people. Change in frequency of arguments. I mean, there are lots of examples of where people have been more troubled in their relationships due to the pressure that they've experienced in COVID-19. Change of responsibilities at work. So if you think of these top stressors in people's lives, a lot of them are reflected in the COVID-19 experience. Now at work, there are two types of stressors. We're going to start off with what we might call good stressors, and what the research literature calls those is challenge demands. And the reason that they're challenge demands is because whilst they're challenging, there seems to be a value in dealing with them. In other words, they add to your life rather than detracting from your work life. So pressure of workload as it goes up tends to increase people's levels of well-being until it gets to the point where it becomes damaging. So more work is not necessarily a bad thing for most employees, it's a good thing. Then there's the pressure of processing lots of information and the pressure of problem solving. And the reason that they are positive stressors, once more, they improve people's levels of well-being at work, because we don't like to do work which is thoughtless, boring, repetitive. It's better for us to do work which is intellectually challenging. And so that's why these are good stressors. Then there are bad stressors and lack of social support. Now we know across Australia that there have been many people who've worked remotely, and the statistics on remote working is that if you take 1,000 people who work in an office and send them to work remotely, in 1,000 people, their levels of well-being, their levels of engagement, their levels of positive emotion are going to be a little higher than when they were in the office. But at an individual level, there's extremely wide variability. So if you have a certain personality profile, particularly if you're an introvert and you're an emotionally stable introvert, working from home is heaven. It's an opportunity to concentrate more on your work. It's an opportunity to be distracted less. It's an opportunity not to have to do things like commute. And so for those people, this is a wonderful situation, working from home. If you're an emotionally unstable extrovert, so you're somebody who needs emotional comfort and support from other people, and you're an extrovert which says that you like to be with people, then of course working from home is a terrible thing. You feel isolated, you feel that you lack social support, and so it really varies from individual to individual. But on balance, it's been shown in research around the world that if you take large populations of employees and send them remote, in other words, not working from home, they're slightly more productive and they're slightly happier in their work. But yes, as I said, that varies enormously from individual to individual. Job insecurity, of course, is a negative stressor. Inadequate resources, and we see this, don't we, in different organisations. Some have had wonderful technology to send people working remotely, others have not. Role ambiguity. I think one of the things that we know is that for some people, what their job is supposed to actually achieve has changed in a COVID world, and many organisations have changed their business models, which has also led to a situation of role ambiguity. And then role conflict is a hindrance demand, a negative stressor. When person A asks you to do something and person B asks you to do something else, these are negative stressors. So how the brain responds to stress, and the three states of stress response are fight, flight, and freeze. So the fight and flight response came, and the freeze response as well, came from a time when we were hunter-gatherers. It evolved very early in the evolution of human beings, and of course the fight, flight, and freeze response is in many animals. So for instance, the fight response is where the animal decides to stand their corner and they're going to fight away whatever is the stressor that's facing them, the dangerous thing. The flight response is, well, I'm going to run away, or if you're a bird, you literally fly away. And the freeze response is where neither of those are going to work, and so we sort of hunker down and try to hide ourselves and wait out the stress or wait out the challenge that we get. So when a human being experiences stress, the amygdala, which is here, sends a message to the hypothalamus, which is here, and the hypothalamus does a bunch of stuff to our neural system and also our endocrine system, the hormones that we have in our body. So it communicates to the rest of the body in such a way that our heart beats faster, our pupils dilate. Why? Well, this shows you how biological all of this is. The reason that pupils dilate is that in a hunter-gatherer era, the most dangerous time was dusk. And the reason that your pupils dilate is because your peripheral vision is better at dusk if your pupils dilate. It means that you're harder to sneak up on, in effect. We also have rapid breathing. Our senses become sharper, and certainly adrenaline helps this, and our immune system tends to be suppressed. So those are all things that happen biologically. Also, what happens in the fight, flight, and freeze response is that quite often what will happen is that the capillaries on the outside of our body tend to contract for the very practical reason that if we get cut in all of this fighting and fleeing, then we don't bleed so much. And that's why sometimes people look pale under the experience of fight, flight, and freeze. So this really raises the question, is everyone equally stressable? In other words, people's stress response, are they equal in terms of their severity? And the answer is, of course, no. And in fact, this is a really interesting concept from the world of clinical psychology and counselling, the idea of a window of tolerance. Everyone has a window of tolerance. So the definition of when we're within our window of tolerance, we can cope with stress, but the body's in the optimal state, can access both reason and emotion. In other words, we know how we're feeling, but we can still think. We're engaged in what we're doing. We haven't flipped out, and we haven't withdrawn to the point where we are withdrawing from reality. So the fight and flight response gives rise to hyperarousal. And so hyperarousal is where we tend to be overreactive, we have unclear thoughts, and we're emotionally distressed. So we can't calm down. And the alternative is hypoarousal, where we're under-aroused, and that's when we're shutting down. So that's where the animal is hunkering down, hoping that it won't be noticed by the predator. And so we become depressed, lethargic, numb, and unmotivated. So that's the freeze response. Now, the size of this window of tolerance is affected by a range of different things. One of the things that it's affected by is our natural makeup, and I'm going to show you how, for instance, things like cognitive ability and personality can affect our window of tolerance. But our window of tolerance can also be affected by what we've experienced in life. So a fellow by the name of Bessel van der Kolk wrote a wonderful book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is all about the biology of trauma. And what he demonstrated is that when people have been through trauma for extended periods, their window of tolerance actually shrinks. In other words, the situations in which they can be relaxed, they can be in their optimal state, accessing both reason and emotion, actually shrinks. And so they tend to be more likely to be hyper-aroused, hyper-vigilant all the time, or very unaroused, very suppressed in their emotions and suppressed in their thinking. So trauma shrinks our window of tolerance, but more on that later when I get to talk about acute versus chronic stress. So yeah, size of stress and trauma can shrink your window of tolerance, and there's a bunch of techniques. Mindfulness and positive psychology activities can help to extend one's windows of tolerance, and we'll talk about that a little bit more down the track as well. So the idea is that for most people, there is this optimal level of stress, and this is called the inverted U of stress. And the reason it's called an inverted U is that if you imagine really hard, you could see this as an upside down letter U. But if you want to perform optimally, having levels of stress which are too low or too high is bad for performance. And the optimal level of stress is this kind of moderate level of stress. Now, where that moderate level of stress is for each individual will vary. So for some people, if they've got a small window of tolerance, this inverted U would be much more peaked and much more narrow. If, on the other hand, a person is highly resilient, then the optimum level can be wider. By the way, this concept is used a lot in elite sport. If you are in the optimal level of arousal, then you are in what sports people call the zone. So another concept that's used in the world of clinical psychology and counselling is this idea of surge capacity. So if you have a large window of tolerance, you have a large surge capacity, the capacity to surge, to be able to cope with challenging situations. But this is temporary. And so it's almost like you have a resilience bank account which can get depleted under certain circumstances. Now, one of the things that we know is that Covid-19, and I'm talking to you from Victoria in Australia, and Victoria had a very long and I think it's fair to say for many people, traumatic lockdown period. And so for many people, their resilience bank accounts were, if not entirely overdrawn, they certainly were depleted. So the question is, how do we restore our surge capacity? Now, just to talk about the window of tolerance in terms of nature and nurture, your window of tolerance is affected by some things which are genetic, things which are largely inherited from the genes that our parents gave us. And some things can be learned. And one of the things that we know is no matter what your natural tendency to resilience, you can improve your levels of resilience and your window of tolerance by doing certain things. So nature and nurture both play a part. So this is personality, and this model of personality is called the SACS 6. The SACS 6 is a hexaco model of personality based on the work of Kibyum Lee and Mike Ashton, who discovered the Hexaco model of personality, otherwise known as the six-factor model of personality, or Big Six. So some of these things affect markedly, some of these six dominant personality characteristics affect markedly your window of tolerance. So for instance, if you are highly emotional, what that means is that you're going to have a smaller window of tolerance. And so being threat sensitive, anxious, having a lack of independence, or being overly empathic, where you empathize so deeply with other people that in effect you take on their emotional responses, having high levels of these things make you less resilient, and they also reduce your surge capacity and your window of tolerance. So in effect, you could call this the flight response. Then you have the fight response. So absence of anger, so carrying grudge, being harsh, having to have things your own way, or being quick to anger. So when a person's high in this, what that will mean is that they are likely to have the fight response. And what that means is that they are extremely likely to have a smaller window of tolerance. Not because they're likely to run away, but because they're likely to be angry and therefore difficult to deal with. Then you have conscientiousness. People who are highly conscientious can be shown to be people who are more likely to be resilient. Conscientiousness is the tendency to be organised, persistent, hard-working, thoughtful in making decisions. And so people who have high levels of conscientiousness, particularly if they are lucky enough to have low emotionality and low absence of anger, are much more likely to be resilient. And then it is true that extroverts tend to be more resilient and tend to have a bigger window of tolerance than introverts. Now, I am an introvert, but I must grudgingly confess this to extroverts. It turns out that extroverts are more likely to draw on social contact to help them through tough times, whereas introverts might be more likely to withdraw within themselves and not get the benefit of the support that social contact can bring you. It is also fair to say that extroverts tend to be a bit more naturally cheerful and optimistic than introverts, and so this is a help as well from the point of view of a window of tolerance. Now, the degree to which you are honest, truthful, straightforward, and that's what integrity, modesty means, and the modesty bit means an absence of arrogance. So honest people are often absent of arrogance, and that means that they have the capacity to be truthful and they feel that rules apply to them. Now, people with high levels of integrity and modesty are certainly positive influences on the resilience and surge capacity of their colleagues, because honesty and authenticity is a really important benefit. Openness to experience is all about the degree to which a person is naturally broad-minded and can cope comfortably with new things. Openness to experience is a positive characteristic if the world is changing rapidly around you. So there's some characteristics of personality. So one of the things that drives resilience is simply the level of positive emotions that we have. A person who has high levels of positive emotions tends to be more resilient than other people. And what this diagram shows is that our levels of resilience do vary over time. There are times when we are more happy, more confident, more positive in our approach to life. Then something bad happens and we become less so. But there is a baseline that most people move around, most people oscillate around, and that baseline appears to be extremely heavily genetically determined. So I'm sure that you've known people who you would consider to be naturally optimistic and positive people, and you've also known people who you might consider to be gloomy and pessimistic. And that set point, which tends to be quite consistent over life very often, could be as much as 2/3 genetic. Now, cognitive ability has an effect on people's ability to cope with difficult circumstances. So people with higher cognitive ability have a natural capacity to learn and to adopt a wider range of solutions and to adapt to a wider range of challenges. So people who are smart tend to be good at words, good at numbers, good at problem solving. Those three things can be very helpful in increasing a person's window of tolerance, because quite often people who are smarter are the sort of people who have a broader range of solutions available to them than people who are perhaps less gifted from a cognitive ability point of view. Now, one of the things that we do know, though, is if smart people are also highly emotionally unstable, that can be a recipe for very creative fretting. People who are like that tend to fret a lot and can concern themselves very deeply with a range of possibilities that perhaps they wouldn't be able to consider if they weren't so smart. And a person's values will also affect their window of tolerance, which is to say, when something's happening at work, how it fits in with the person's values. And this is a model, SACS work values model, derived from and expressing the Schwartz model of values, but applied particularly to work situation. We identified 11 values in partnership in a project in partnership with Deakin University. And so if, for instance, your organisation is strongly committed to helping and supporting, but you are less so, that will also affect your perception or your ability to cope with circumstances. So if something is strongly antagonistic to your values set, so let's say, obviously this is a person who's relatively modest in environmental sustainability, and it would be fair to say that this diagram shows a person whose values are not particularly strong anyway. This dark line is the 50th percentile, representing the population average for Australia and New Zealand. If somebody is relatively low in environmental sustainability, but the organisation is very high, then of course there's a values mismatch there, and that will affect the person's window of tolerance. They'll be less able to cope with the circumstances that they're facing. The opposite is also true. Let's say the person is extremely high in social justice, and the changes that take place in the organisation cause the person to feel that the organisation is less committed to social justice. That will also affect the person's resilience and their ability to cope. Now, you can measure resilience. This is an example of the SACS resilience test, and so we ask people about 5 or 6 questions embedded in a whole bunch of other questions, and you can see that this person is high in resilience, which means that they're likely to have a big window of tolerance, a bigger window of tolerance than if they were low. So that's a positive thing. So I'm going to show you some sector profiles for the disability sector, and this will give you the opportunity of making a judgment about resilience, window of tolerance, surge capacity of the sector overall. The first, I'm going to show you some cognitive ability profiles. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be showing you the profiles in the form of percentiles. So these percentiles, if you're at the 10th percentile, that's low. It means that your score is higher than 10% of anybody who's ever completed this instrument. 90th percentile is high because it means that you're higher than 90% of anybody who's ever completed. Population average is 50th percentile, and that's why we've put the solid line at 50. So the norms here are in fact professionals across Australia and New Zealand. And what you see here is aged care, disability and the not-for-profit sector. So I'll show you the scores for the aged care sector, the disability sector and the general not-for-profit sector. Aged care is straightforward, disability is straightforward. The general not-for-profit sector includes organisations like peak bodies, community organisations, in effect any not-for-profit organisation which is not dealing with aged care or disability. And the first thing you notice about these, yes, there are differences, and certainly the general not-for-profit sector is a higher set of scores than disability or aged care. And so this is population average for professionals in Australia. And so it could be said that this is not great news for the community sectors across Australia and New Zealand because these scores are relatively modest in comparison with commerce. And you wonder why. And I think the main reason is that if you think of these sectors, they are lower paying sectors than the world of general employment for professionals in Australia is. So many people who are in the sector for reasons of values, and so they tend not to be paid as much as, for instance, let's use a practical example. A chief finance officer in a $200 million not-for-profit is not likely to be paid as much as a chief finance officer in a $200 million manufacturing company or transport company or something like that. We do know that cognitive ability goes with dollars. So the more you pay, the more likely you are to have people with high cognitive abilities. So I think one of the things that's going on here is remuneration has led organisations to attract a lower level of cognitive ability in the candidates that they've seen. Now, at an individual organisational level, this does not apply, because we've certainly seen organisations that have chosen to psych test on the way in, and their average level of cognitive ability can be higher, because in effect they're discriminating in favour of people who are smarter. But I think that one of the things that you may conclude by these relatively modest cognitive ability scores across the sector is that a capacity to rapidly change is not likely to be quite as strong in these sectors as it would be in, let's say, the banking sector, where you would have high levels of cognitive ability. Obviously, you're going to find differences in values and personality, which will also have an effect, but cognitive ability, that's what we're finding, relatively modest score in these community sectors. So to turn our attention to values, this is where the news is markedly better. So these are values profiles of the three sectors. So firstly, the aged care sector, secondly, the disability care sector, and thirdly, the general not-for-profit sector. So I guess going back to the previous diagram briefly, I guess one of the things that you'd also notice is that you notice that these sets of scores, even though we're dealing with hundreds of people, in total this was well over 2,000 or 3,000 people, you notice that the scores are relatively similar. So it says that there's a kind of a not-for-profit-ish kind of a person. Well, same applies for values. There are not-for-profit-ish values, because whilst there are differences, and probably the biggest differences are in this thing of universalism, and what it says is that people who are in the disability sector are more universalistic than aged care and the general not-for-profit sector. Let me just explain what universalism means. Universalism is the value of, I want to make the world a better place. Now, values, remember, are not genetic. They tend to be learned by people as they are growing. And so people in the disability sector tend to be, well, kind of more principled, if you want to put it that way, slightly, than the aged care or the general not-for-profit sector. By the way, those sectors are clearly well above population average for other professionals in Australia. And so what you see is very similar values across the sector. Tradition. The aged care sector tends to be slightly more traditional than the others. But apart from that, I mean, hedonism, which is all about seeking to have fun or enjoyable times and in your life, which is relatively modest for the whole sector. Power seeking, relatively low. Achievement in the sense of being ambitious, that's what achievement means, ambition, that's relatively low. Stimulation, which is all about wanting to do new and different things all the time, quite low. Self-direction, very low for the sector, which may mean that it's hard to get people who are really keen to take ownership and lead. But certainly very high in rule respecting and in security consciousness, which means I want to take care of people and I want to make sure that people are looked after. So very similar values. Now, one of the things that we find is that when you have sectors that have such similar values, what it means is that those values are also very strongly held. I mean, for instance, look at things like this, where power and conformity, which is all about I don't want to offend people, I want to obey the rules. See how close they are, but also how far they are from population average. These are strong values. So as you adapt to COVID-19 and the post-COVID-19 world, one of the things that's going to be very important to ensure success with your staff is that you are maintaining a set of values that they can relate to. Because as you diverge from these strongly held values, you're going to run into the situation where they start to feel uncomfortable, they start to feel that the organisation no longer stands for what they joined the organisation to represent, and that will be a challenge. Personalities, this is specifically about support workers, and what we see here is that this is profiles of support workers, which, and again, based on some thousands of people. But you see that your average support worker in personality terms is a very honest, straightforward, non-arrogant kind of a person. They also tend to be quite low in anxiety, which is interesting, isn't it? The sector is attracting people who are, on balance, relatively resilient. I mean, we're talking about comparisons with professionals across Australia. Relatively low anxiety means that the person should have a little bit higher surge capacity and window of tolerance than most people. Most support workers are very extroverted individuals. That's one of the reasons why they join the sector, because it's a people-orientated sector. Agreeableness means a very strong tendency not to get angry. So the sector is likely to be tolerant, unlikely to go into fight mode very rapidly. So a tolerant, gentle workforce, if you want to put it that way. And also, if you look at these conscientiousness figures, a quite committed and energetic workforce. And then openness to experience, which is all about, can I cope with change? Yeah, just a little above population average. So honest, relatively resilient, people orientated, and unlikely to get angry. So I think that the sector overall should, as a general rule, be able to cope quite well from a personality point of view, given that these characteristics are favourable in terms of window of tolerance. Now, once more, incredibly wide variability from individual to individual, but it is interesting to see such large divergences from population average in what are large samples. That's a little unusual. And it says that there is a not-for-profit kind of a person, there is a support worker kind of a personality, and fortunately it seems to be a relatively resilient kind of a personality. I want to talk about stress and when it becomes acute or chronic. So acute is here and now, chronic is when stress becomes kind of embedded in your system. And so we evolved to deal with short-term stressors, the saber-toothed tiger. Our issue with a saber-toothed tiger is typically resolved quickly. We survive or we don't. But we know that for many people, stress can become chronic after only 6 months. And if you think of the COVID-19 experience for many people across Australia, it's been more than 6 months. So talking about chronic stress, we know that stress can kill brain cells. We know that changes in brain structure can happen, including increased imbalances in white and grey matter. Grey matter is how we process information. White matter is in effect the connective tissue, the nerve tissue that connects the various repositories of grey matter with one another. So if you are under chronic stress, what will happen is that you'll have fewer neurons and therefore an excess of white matter. This disrupts the balance and timing of communication within the brain. And so under stress, particularly if the stress is long-term and chronic, we can make worse decisions. So some other things. Evidence that persistent stress can actually rewire the brain. It can cause changes in the process of memory. Have you ever noticed that sometimes it's harder to remember things when you're under stress? So literally, that happens, and we can forget words and spatial relations, which is how we navigate ourselves around a city or something like that. That can go very rapidly when we're under stress. We can also end up with mood disorders such as depression, other mental illnesses, and you can also have effects on the gastrointestinal system. Now, one of the things, if you follow the world of neurology or psychology, you'll start to get an increasing picture of how important the gastrointestinal system is to a person's psychological health. And certainly we've seen autism spectrum disorders associated with gastrointestinal problems, for instance. Also stress. When people are really stressed, it can affect their gastrointestinal system, which in turn seems to have a mood effect and even a cognition effect. We have vastly underestimated the gastrointestinal system historically in psychology. So stress can become trauma. Traumatic stress can be caused by prolonged traumatic experience. If this continues, your nervous system remains stuck and intense systems linger. As I mentioned, Bessel van der Kolk in the book The Body Keeps the Score explains this at length and in fascinating detail. So symptoms can get worse and interfere with daily life, and then that can lead to PTSD. It's been really interesting talking to a range of people around Australia about their experiences, and a number of them have started to say that they've had nightmares about things associated with COVID-19 or about going back to work. And so these things apply to going back to work as much as they do about the COVID-19 experience. I mean, think of if you're frightened of the disease, if you're frightened of its effect on your life or perhaps your work, all of a sudden you're confronted with the fact that you're going to have to go back into a typical office situation that, of course, of itself is a stressful experience. So that raises the question of, is it all bad? And the answer is no. There's a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth where people actually get better by experiencing stressful situations. So that can be things like the SARS epidemic. We found after the SARS epidemic that The SARS epidemic brought on some positive impact: better family and social support, healthier lifestyle, and mental health awareness. And one of the things that we know is that you can get a stealing effect from exposure to stressors. That can build your resilience. And post-traumatic resilience is really a form of behavioural adaptation to stress and a style of behavioural function. And it really is associated with once you've overcome trauma, it can give you a high degree of self-confidence, of what these researchers called ego resilience, flexibility, energy, assertiveness. So recovering from this kind of thing can be very good for you. Now, some warning signs. Here are some stressors as identified by the Heads Up organisation, things that you can use to identify whether you are stressed. Do you feel overwhelmed or frustrated? Have you been feeling guilty or unhappy? Have you been irritable in recent times? Have you lost confidence or been indecisive? Found yourself thinking negatively, having racing thoughts, having memory problems or excessive worrying? These are stress indicators. And it may well be worthwhile reflecting on this. If you want to do a simple diagnosis of this, maybe rate yourself out of 10 on each of these and just reflect back on the pattern. So if they're higher than sort of somewhere between 3 on average, then it may well be that you are experiencing stress. But how about colleagues? And when we say colleagues, we don't mean just people that you work with. Maybe the people that you're interacting with, your stakeholders. Do they seem more anxious than normal? Are they losing their temper more quickly? Are they noisier than usual? In other words, needing to talk more? Or are they quieter? Have they lost their sense of humour? Are they less confident? In other words, not prepared to take on some things that historically they would have. Are they avoiding you or are they over contacting you? These kinds of changes can be indicators of whether people are stressed. So how to explore this? Well, we all know about are you okay, and that's a good thing to do. But sometimes it's difficult for a person to say, I'm not okay. So I'm going to suggest a technique called feed forward. So feed forward is a useful thing in giving people guidance, but it's also a useful thing in asking for guidance. Feed forward is talking about the future. So instead of saying, are you okay? How are you coping? It can be things like, is there anything I can do to help make this work as well as possible for you? Let's talk about anything which is getting you in the way at the moment so I can help you get on top of it. Do you have any suggestions about how to make these arrangements as successful as possible? And all of those things are future focused, which causes them to be easier to say. Why? Things that are focused on the past tend to engage the amygdala, which is associated with anxiety, depression, or vulnerability. And things that are future focused tends to turn on the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain which is more creative and more broad-minded. And that can certainly help people to explore their feelings more and to speak more readily to you. I mean, if a boss asks a staff member, are you okay? The person may want to put a brave face on it, if for no other reason than for reasons of seeming like they're coping. So making these things future focused turns on the new brain, and also decide when you need help. These issues can become clinical and may need EAP. So it raises the question of what we can do about it. Now, one of the things that we know is that one of the things that really determines a person's well-being in respect of these things is focus. We're going to talk in a little while about mindfulness, but mindfulness is a focus management technique, and certainly mindfulness is something that we know works for many people, but everybody, no matter what situation you're facing, has the choice of focus. And here's a quote, this is a quote from me, by the way: the secret of life is what you focus on. So people who are able to focus on things that help them can be more resilient than people who focus on things that harm them. So optimism and positivity rather than pessimism and negativity. Now, diary research. So this is indicating a study that's been undertaken on many occasions across the world. You get 2 groups, 200 people in each group, matched for age and gender and optimism and a whole bunch of other things, and you get one of these groups of 200 people to keep what's called an optimism diary, where they record the things that have happened to them that are good. So you might write down the blessings that you experience each day, the good things that happen to you, or what you're looking forward to each day. The alternative is to write down the things that have challenged you each day. Now, if you seek ethics approval for this study, in certain universities you'll struggle to get it, because we know that the people who keep the optimism diary tend to have much higher levels of well-being and tend to improve their levels of well-being, but the people who keep the pessimism diaries tend to have declining levels of well-being. So we should understand that focusing on the positive does improve people's levels of well-being. Focusing on the negative tends to damage their well-being, and I will strongly recommend that if you're in a leadership role, focusing on what we're going to do, focusing on solutions, focusing on the optimism about where we can go in the current situation is going to be an improver. Now, that doesn't mean that you take a don't worry, be happy perspective on life. It means that you take a self-efficacy perspective on life. If you take a don't worry, be happy, don't worry everybody, everything's going to be fine, people tend not to believe that. A self-efficacy perspective is, hey, this might be tough, but I reckon we can cope. A self-efficacy perspective is, I know that we're a good team. We will cope with this. We will adjust. We will get it done. That kind of perspective tends to be very developmental and helpful in people's well-being. A focus on solutions rather than emotions. So if you went back some decades ago, the focus was that you needed to tell each other about your emotions. And we know that if you do that, two things happen. Venting strong emotions tends to make our capacity to feel those strong emotions stronger. Practicing emotions is like anything else in the nervous system. It will entrench them as neural pathways. Now, that's not to say that you avoid emotions or that you hide from emotions, but venting emotions in front of your colleagues tends to also damage their levels of emotions. So emotional matters should be dealt with away from the gaze of all of your colleagues. They should be dealt with a caring leader, or perhaps even EAP if they are strong enough. But really what we're trying to do is to not expose people to a bunch of negative material. So if something goes wrong at work and we sit down with a group of colleagues to fix it, that tends to result in higher levels of well-being. If we tell each other how we feel about it, that tends to result in lower levels of well-being, but also lower levels of productivity. A focus on the future. People who are effective and resilient tend to be connected to their future. I don't mean the future 5 years down the track. It can be as simple as in a group discussing what we're looking forward to doing or what we're looking forward to achieving in the coming week. A focus on what you can control and consciously directing focus away from what you can't control. Very powerful cognitive behavioural therapy technique. We become consciously aware of focusing on the things that we have some influence over and ignoring the things that we don't have any influence over. So, the economy. What can we do about the economy? Well, at an individual level, nothing. What can we do about our own activities to maximise our success? We can do a lot about that. So this is a technique that's associated with a thing called locus of control. So the diagram that you see in front of you shows a person with an internal locus of control. This star represents control. A person with an internal locus of control has what the counsellors like to call agency, a belief that they can influence outcomes in their life. This is a person with an external locus of control, and an external locus of control suggests that the person has a belief that they can't influence the things that are affecting their lives. Now, many techniques to improve resilience are about taking an external locus of control and making it an internal locus of control. So, things like focusing on what you can influence and ignoring what you can't influence, that's a classic locus of control technique. So I just wanted to give you a few self-management tips about how to cope during these tough times. And certainly one of the things that's taken for granted sometimes, but exercise is nearly the best thing you can possibly do for yourself, both for mental and physical health. There have been so many studies over the years that showed things like aerobic or anaerobic exercise, how they can affect people's levels of well-being is just about the best thing you can do for yourself. If you're stressed, all of those stress chemicals evolved to drive action, so fight, flight. So why don't you use them for physical action? It will increase your well-being markedly. Seek to connect people, activities, consciously avoid isolating yourself. So what we mean there is that if you are an extrovert, connect with people. If you're an introvert, connect with a smaller group of valued people, but also connect with activities that you love. Look after yourself. Eat healthy, non-refined foods. And you'll see that this paper here talks about omega-3 fatty acids and how they affect people's levels of well-being. We do know that people who eat junk food, particularly high glycemic food which is starchy or sugary, which is rapidly turned into blood sugar, that tends to cause people to be more anxious and depressed. Eating non-refined foods tends to improve our levels of well-being, psychological and physical. Avoid drugs and alcohol. Yes, well, they are a short-term solution, and certainly one of the things that we know is that alcohol tends to have a depressing effect on the nervous system, and therefore, whilst it might feel good while you're doing it, subsequently it tends to result in increased levels of depression. So that ain't the solution. Mindfulness. I want to talk briefly about mindfulness. Mindfulness is all about practicing focus management. So it's about becoming conscious of what you are focusing on and consciously focusing on something helpful rather than focusing on something which is not helpful, and practicing this. Now, I don't need to give you a great big herogram on mindfulness. There's lots of information about how effective mindfulness is. And really, for about 98% of the population, it tends to increase people's levels of well-being, decrease levels of depression, decrease levels of anxiety. It's worthwhile. But mindfulness also relates to your perspective on things. It's a not jumping to conclusions kind of a perspective. If somebody does something that you don't like, it could be, oh, she hates me. Well, actually, maybe she's stressed. Maybe she's under pressure. Maybe she's got challenges of her own. And thinking more mindfully once more tends to take pressure off our relationships and take pressure off ourselves at an individual level. So we can mindfully respond to life situations. This is really bad. It's the end of the world. Becomes, okay, well, what are my options? And what am I going to do? What are my degrees of freedom in this situation? So here's a simple model of mindfulness. I know people talk a lot about mindfulness, and in my experience, not everybody's quite clear in their own mind about what mindfulness means. So the idea of mindfulness is that to tackle any task, let's say you have 100 potential units of mental energy. What you often find is that you don't use those 100 units of mental energy to focus on whatever your task is, because some of your mental energy is taken up with what you might call narrative. Narrative is what you are telling yourself when you should be doing whatever it is that you need to do. Narrative is a message that you're sending yourself, which might be along the lines, let's say we're talking about public speaking. It could be, well, I'm not really a good public speaker. It could be, I should have prepared more. It could be, that person in the front row is really not listening to me. Those are all narrative components. But we know that you give the best possible speech when you focus on the here and now. Focus on the things that you need to do in order to give a good presentation. So you might focus on your subject matter, or you might focus on the speed of your presentation, or you might focus on slowing down, which is something that I often recommend to people who are nervous about public speaking. Now, historically, what we used to say is that we need to suppress the narrative. So that was the technique. People were taught to squish the narrative, to fight it down. Let me tell you about one of the strange characteristics of the human brain. This is due to a thing called the quantum Zeno effect, if you want to look it up. But the things that you try to suppress in the human brain actually get stronger. So the alternative to trying to squish the narrative is to practice focusing on the here and now. And focusing on the here and now is often linked back to things like meditation type activities. Meditation activities might be where you sit there, close your eyes, listen to the sounds around you, and try to be in the here and now. Well, now the narrative thoughts will come, and you don't fight them, you just notice them and let them drift away and return your attention to the here and now. So that's a simple mindfulness technique, and obviously there are dozens of options. John Kabat-Zinn, who brought the whole idea of mindfulness to the Western world in a scientific way, has wonderful videos on YouTube, but there are also a bunch of apps like Headspace and Mind, so you can use those kinds of apps to take you through simple meditations. Worthwhile exploring. 98% of the population benefits from mindfulness activities. They work for most people, and that is, thanks to John Kabat-Zinn, why the US government spends hundreds of millions of dollars on a thing called mindfulness-based stress reduction, because people who used to be medicated for stress now are able to deal with it by using mindfulness techniques. Kabat-Zinn, by the way, his early research was, of all things, it targeted towards chronic pain, and he demonstrated how mindfulness activities help people to manage chronic pain without painkillers, a great outcome. So how leaders can contribute during COVID-19? Well, you can measure it. You can measure the levels of stress in your workforce. We have instruments to do that. You can measure stressors in your workforce, which is to say these are good stressors, and so you see that the workload about population average, information processing and problem solving are low, which means that the work is not particularly positively challenging. And some of these negative stressors are very high, so role ambiguity is high, conflicting expectations about average, but social exclusion high. So that suggests a stressed workforce. Now, one of the things that I think is really important to understand about well-being is that culture is local. So the great driver of people's well-being at work, 80% of their well-being comes from their job, their team, and their leader. This idea was originally derived by a gentleman by the name of Mark Griffin, who wrote an article called something like "Employees Live in Four Worlds: the world of the job, the world of the team, the world of the leader, and the world of the organisation." And people in general vastly overestimate the importance of the organisation. For most people, the organisation accounts for only 20% of their well-being. So what that means is that from a leadership point of view, if you're able to do good stuff at the level of your local team, so let's say you've got 10 people working with you in an organisation of 1,000, you can have 80% impact on their well-being by doing stuff about their job, about the team, and about your own leadership. So let's talk a little more about what leadership is, effective leadership in tough times like the COVID-19 crisis. Firstly, one of the things that can be really useful is to take ambiguity away and give people an opportunity of focusing on a good future by focusing on a destination. Let's get together and decide where we want to be in 6 months' time. Let's make a plan to get there. A very solution-focused idea, but creating a really clear destination, and I suggest that this be done extremely facilitatively, in other words, working with all of the employees in this group to make sure that they create this destination. That's going to cause a high degree of engagement in that destination, and the plan to get there, that will create a sense of optimism that they will be able to achieve that destination. Talk through with people about focusing on what we can control and ignoring what we can't. I mean, if people are constantly adverting to the negative circumstances around them that can't be controlled, all that is a morale tapper. And what we really need is a focus on what we can control and a sense of energy about wanting to do that. Focus on the positive. Let's talk about the good things that we've achieved. By the way, negatives appear to have about 3 to 6 times the impact of positives for most people. So if I say something negative to you, I have to say between 3 and 6 good things, positive things, just to get you back to where you were before I spoke at all. So a good corporate culture, well, corporate culture being a group-based culture, because the biggest differences in corporate culture are not between corporations, they're between groups within the one organisation. But a good culture in a group is where the positive behaviours outweigh the negative behaviours, let's say 6 to 1. If you do that, we should have an improving corporate culture and a sense of positivity and optimism. A focus on solutions rather than emotional. Let's get together and come up with our best way of doing this rather than let's tell each other how we feel. A focus on self-efficacy, and self-efficacy at an individual level and at a group level. So leaders can cause the group to understand, hey, I am confident that we can achieve what we need to achieve here. And so we do it together. We work out positive ways of moving towards whatever our destination is. Whatever we've decided is where we want to be in 6 months' time, let's now do things to get there. So the relationship between stress and control is a really important one. So when people have low levels of stress and low levels of control, so they don't have much empowerment in their work, it tends to be a sleepy environment. I'm not stressed, but I don't have much control, so I'm relatively unmotivated. On the other hand, people who have high levels of stress and low levels of control, you run the risk of burnout. Now, burnout is not just a word. Burnout is a psychological phenomenon. When people are highly stressed and they don't have any empowerment over their situation, that is a risk of burnout. And so that is the quadrant above all else to be avoided. Then you have the situation where we're low in stress and high in control or high in empowerment, and that's when the group will be comfortable, relaxed. The Americans would say a country club style of leadership. And then you have a situation where you're high in stress and high in control. And in fact, if you reflect on the most satisfying period in your career, it may well be that time where you had a high level of stress, really important goals to pursue, maybe really important agendas, maybe a tight time frame, but you had a lot of control in how you went about it. And that can be a peak experience. But one of the things that we also know, most people can't keep running at that high forever. And in particular, your recruitment practices will be likely to determine how the average employee is able to cope with this. If you recruit people who are highly resilient, they can live in this quadrant longer than people who are not so resilient. So the essence of all of that is that the degree of empowerment that you give employees is absolutely crucial to their levels of well-being. And so we believe that there are three leadership options. In studies that we've done both by ourselves and with university partners, we've been able to identify multiple times that the single most powerful thing you can do to improve people's levels of engagement, well-being, energy, morale, is to empower them, cause them to be able to make important decisions about their work. So, three potential leadership options. Leadership option one is top-down. That's where the person says, I am the boss, I'm going to tell you what to do. Now, to be a good leader, you do need to do this. You cannot get by without being able to instruct, inform, educate an individual or group. When somebody walks into work on their first day, we typically don't say, well, what do you want to do? We typically say, all right, well, here's what your induction program will look like. Here's where you'll sit. Here's how this will interact. I'm going to have a meeting with you at 2 o'clock this afternoon to take your induction forward. That's top down. The second model of leadership is consultation. And that's where a leader will go to staff, so this is the leader here, and ask people their opinions. And then typically they go back to their office and think about it and they decide. The only problem is that if this person here says you should do X and you actually decide to do Y, then in their mind, you've just done this. You've been a top-down leader. And one of the things that you also know if you've done this kind of consultation is that these people put enormous effort into preparing for that interaction, and quite often they have very well worked up perspectives on what you should do. So in the risk you run with consultation, and I'm not saying don't do it, but the risk you run with consultation is that it can appear that you really have pretended to consult people if ultimately you decide to do something that they didn't do. The third alternative is facilitation, where you get a group of people together and you facilitate a discussion and a decision-making process. And I recommend that if you bring an issue to your staff to resolve, and this is the most empowering thing you can do, what you really should do is you should say up front, look, a majority vote will win this. By the way, don't bring this technique if you really made up your mind what you want to do. This is where you really believe, okay, I want the staff to decide this. And you see we've got 5 people in one room. Now this room could be a virtual room like a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting, or it could be a physical room where people sit together. But it's really valuable sometimes to split this group into subgroups, say a group of 2 and a group of 3, and then you get them to talk things over and to decide what they want to do about an issue and then to vote for it. And so facilitative leadership is where the leader says, okay, well, you've decided to do this, I'm going to back that, and that is what we will go with. Now you can see, going back to the previous diagram, if you are then using facilitative leadership, you're really in the high control quadrant. You're giving staff an understanding that they their view is crucial and that you will go with their view. Now, of course, good leadership is deciding when you should do this, when you should do this, and when you should do this. And I don't really have the time to go into this in massive detail at the moment, but suffice it to say, if you don't do this, then you're going to have lower levels of morale and well-being in your group if you're doing only this or only this, let's say. Empowerment is crucial to well-being and productivity. It's a really good idea to recruit resilient staff who are dispositionally able to cope, and there are ways of doing that, particularly with psych testing. Take care of your own well-being, basic healthy lifestyle, and the power of focus. Focus on things that's going to be kind to you and help you. Next, develop the skills to assess the well-being of your colleagues, and we've given you some suggestions on that today. Lead for focus. Be conscious of what you're directing your colleagues' attention to, because that will make a massive difference to their levels of well-being. Lead for support. Be supportive to them at a human level, and lead for empowerment. Try to use facilitative leadership. So we're in a situation where people are returning to work, and some people want to do that, some people don't want to do that. Why not provide an opportunity for a group of employees to determine how they would like this to happen? I mean, we do know that I think the big lesson for many organisations has been how productive people have been when they've worked from home, and the fact that people have continued to work very assiduously and they've created good quality work. And we know that some people are simply better suited to working from home than working in offices. So I think there's a wonderful opportunity for that to become part of the ongoing workforce makeup of Australia, how many people work remotely. You can't do much about people's life stress, but you can make a big impact on work-related stress. And work-related stress certainly tends to affect people's life stress. If people are stressed at home, they come to work sometimes to escape that stress. But if you're stressed at work, it takes up so much time in your day, it's very hard to escape. And finally, know when to send for the experts. This is challenging stuff, and EAP can be your best friend under these difficult times. Thanks very much for listening, and may the rest of your year be non-stressful.